Ladies and gentlemen, we're back, and this is a really important topic. I'm kind of dreading putting it out there because I know that the troll army is going to attack in full force. Every time I release something related to COVID, it really does seem like a bat signal goes out to all the crazies all across the web, and they descend to attack. I have a new protocol now. If there's an actual good faith discussion or to be had, if there's an actual good faith question, I'll try my best to answer it. I don't know the answers to everything, which is why I have people like today's guest on. But if you're just using my platform to, amplify your pile of disinformation, I'm just going to block you. Goodbye. So that's my new protocol. It actually has brought me a fair bit of serenity, and it's greatly satisfying. I think the last time I released a podcast on this topic, I blocked 500 people within 2 days. So without further ado, I'm going to bring in Dr. Nicholas Tyau. He's been on the podcast before. You were on the podcast back in September of 2020. I'm just going to call you Nick. I'm sorry. Dr. Tyau.
No, Nick is fine, please.
Nick is an internal medicine specialist in New York. He was at COVID Ground Zero. He got COVID. In that episode that we did, I think it was number 285, we said that we'd bring you back when the vaccines were out and when there was some questions about it. So I'll just hit you with a question that I'm getting most often from people in good faith. And that is, hey, Stephan, I've got my second dose of vaccine now. I'm fully immunized. Is it okay to go back and train? And I've been telling people my answer and saying it's tentative. I don't know 100% yet, but I'd like to. I'm sure you're getting asked the same thing, Nick. So what is your default answer at this point in time? And we should timestamp this. This is mid-April 2021, because in 3 weeks we might have different answers.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that nothing is actually cut and dry for me either. We like to use sometimes like these readiness rulers in medicine, kind of on a scale. Let's say 1 is you're absolutely not ready to do something, 10 being yes, 100% gung ho, let's go for it. I'd say that the needle for me personally has kind of moved a little bit more towards ready, but I'm still not at a 10. And let's say back in September, I was probably at like a 3. Maybe I'm now like approaching a 6 or a 7. So kind of what goes into that. And Stephan, please stop me if I'm kind of going too much into the weeds here. But, when it comes to kind of thinking about training again, I'm weighing a number of different things in my mind. Now,
what are you weighing?
Yeah, so one thing that the CDC did release something regarding being indoors with vaccinated people and being maskless. Now, to me, that was a little bold, but the CDC went ahead and put that out there. So while I personally don't even do that for myself, I do know that people are starting to do that. And if that's one of the recommendations now, then, for people to get together and train, I think is probably a bit better than it was back in September. And, even when I was just listening to Dr. Moriarty's talk in February, I think we're getting some data that is, could be kind of encouraging in some ways. So one of the things that I'm kind of looking at is not necessarily the case rate, because the way that a lot of countries, and especially the U.S., has been prioritizing vaccinating people are the sickest and the oldest people first. So those people have been the high, and take out the healthcare workers for a moment, they're a minority of it. Mostly it's the sicker people and the older people. And those people are less likely to have risky behaviors. So while cases may go up, those cases could be among the healthier individuals who may ultimately be fine with COVID and recover like a lot of people do. Where you got to watch are the hospitalization rates in terms of what's hospital capacity, what's ICU capacity. So if wherever you're at, hospitals and ICUs are at capacity, and what we define by that is consistently greater than, I think it's 75 or 80% at capacity. I mean, no ICUs should ever be empty because medicine's kind of a business and there's always really sick people. But to be at critical capacity, we're talking at like, days or weeks of being at 80% or greater, and that's what was happening this past winter in New York. So That's one major barometer that, depending on where you live, is could be pretty easy to find that that information.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that I look at. I think though on a less data driven level, but more kind of in a, I'm going to bring it back kind of to martial arts for a while. Like a lot of my mindset has been influenced by martial arts. Like when I started medical school, I started BJJ, and then I also started FMA, Filipino Martial Arts, and I studied studying Atienza Kali under Carl Atienza. So a lot of that mindset training is kind of tracking what your opponent is doing, and in this case, the opponent is COVID. And in the beginning of this pandemic, we knew very little about it. And in fact, as an opponent, and Stephan, you've done some FMA in the past too, probably still do. Setting up your opponent for a shot with a stick or a blade involves just like BJJ, certain other moves that you want people to then give you a predictable response to. So with COVID, we didn't know what those responses were going to be, and in fact, it's kind of slick because even if it didn't kill you, you could be sick and then pass out onto somebody else, and then you could kill them. So aside from the data, the stuff that I was just speaking about, using that kind of mindset mentality and thinking, okay, is the risk of me getting somebody, not even myself, because right now I've had COVID and I've had the vaccine, and my chances of getting sick again are quite low, but not zero. So if I got sick again, how would I feel if I got either another family friend or a family or a friend, if I got them sick or got their relative sick and they died? So that's like the moral weight that I always ask myself before engaging really in any other activity, grappling aside. So let's create maybe a quasi-realistic scenario that could happen here in New York. Right now, hospitalizations are down. We're vaccinating at a mediocre clip, not ideal. But if by the summer,
you are
still
way ahead of where I live. Just for context here, I'm in British Columbia,
right?
And Canada did not have the capacity for building mRNA vaccines when this thing hit. We are building those, but it's a really complicated process. So I think I looked this up just before we talked. Currently, the state of New York is something like 40% of people have received one dose. In British Columbia, it's 15%. Something like 26% of people have had two doses, and in Canada, it's like 2%.
Yeah.
So we are way under vaccinated. We're probably 2 months behind the States. And we're also right now in the lower mainland where I live, there's a massive spike in cases. We're back up to 15% positivity rates. There's actually Whistler, the world famous ski resort. I heard unofficially that they had 50% positivity. I can't verify that, but somebody who claims to have had an inside line there at Public Health told me that. And they recently shut the whole thing down and basically vaccinated everybody in Whistler, even though we don't have enough vaccines to go around. So it's kind of an interesting, and incidentally, all those, or a significant number of those spikes, something like half, are variant fueled. So it's I think we're at a very different ends of the spectrum, and I think that's really useful for discussion, because we can say, what would you do in New York? What would you do in British Columbia? And by extrapolation, what would you do in Ecuador? What would you do in Poland? What would you do in Ireland?
And so you bring up an excellent point, and I think that, and again, I'm looking at our situation comparing it to, say, Israel, where Israel is approaching kind of 60% of people at least with one vaccine, and they got 40 or 50 something percent who are fully vaccinated. So, I think, when you're doing your own personal calculus about risk taking during this time, we always I think on several occasions you've mentioned this on your podcast. I've also discussed this with people as well. If you're a single person by yourself, you go to work, you want to train, you want to take that risk on by yourself. If you're vaccinated, your overall risk is probably pretty low. I'm pretty confident of that. But even if you live with other relatives, and by now, at least in New York, like a lot of people, a lot of the older folks have gotten vaccinated who want to get it. That's another topic that we can get into. But so it's pretty easy now to be in a house full of vaccinated people. But even so, none of the vaccines are 100%, and I still and this could just also be some of the, we'll call it trauma, but this could be some of the trauma from beforehand. I'm still nervous about potentially getting people in my household sick. That being said, though, my readiness ruler, as I mentioned earlier, is starting to move kind of more towards something more comfortable. I guess my strong, like, if people are beginning to kind of phase out and this guy's talking too much, my strongest recommendation that I can probably feel comfortable coming out with is that if I were to train, I would want to train with either vaccinated people or make an agreement with my training partners, like in a pod or in my class, that if you're not vaccinated, you get tested periodically. I'm not sure how testing is where you are, Stephan. In New York, that is actually something that's pretty readily available, not only through clinics and walk-ins, but we also have on Amazon. You can even get the saliva-based tests, and as far as screening pretty healthy people, the saliva test is probably good enough. So there are options.
We have easy, unlimited, free testing for symptomatic people, but there's not a coherent strategy for testing asymptomatic people. And I understand why, because if you have a very clean population that has almost no COVID, even a very small false positive rate could really throw your numbers off. As it turns out, we don't have a very low percentage. We've got a pretty high percentage going on, so that's less of a concern.
I also wanted to comment that we should keep in mind that the vaccine vaccinating during an outbreak is not going to cause the outbreak to go away. Like a vaccine is a longer term solution, right? Because at the very best estimates, like 4 to 6 weeks past getting vaccinated is when you really start gaining that protection that's getting published in the papers. Especially with the mRNA vaccines, you're looking closer to 6 weeks after your second dose.
You start getting some protection after 10 to 14 days, though, but it's not full.
Correct. So that's another thing to keep in mind for people. Like, the vaccine has never been this thing where we're in the midst of a surge. Vaccinating people is not going to instantly bring that down.
I'll tell you what my personal metric is, because I don't live in a household with terribly elderly people, is that at this point, Stephan Kesting, and this is my calculus, I'm not saying this has to be anyone else's, is I will train in small groups or one-on-one with people who are fully vaccinated. And I'm only partially vaccinated, right? I'm with the fire department, so we got a little bit earlier. So once I'm fully vaccinated, I will train with other people who are fully vaccinated. But that is a luxury that I have, right? I have my own dojo. I have training partners. I have long-standing connections in the community. Some of those people will still talk to me even. And it's not so easy for, Joe Blue Belt to go to his school where the head instructor has probably been alternating between COVID denial Instagram posts, flat earth Instagram posts, and anti-vaccine Instagram posts for the last year, and go to that professor and say, hey, can I create just a vaccinated pod? Can I just train with these 3 guys? That's pretty intimidating. And I think I have a relative luxury there that other people don't. And I imagine that if you did, well, you said, if you would train, you would want to train in a pod of vaccinated people or people who are really checking very often.
Yeah.
How much riskier do you think it is to just go out into the general population and just go back to regular training at the club? Because that is the option for most people, unfortunately. I'm hugely pro home training. I'm hugely pro creating small training pods, and I would suggest to you, if your instructor's been posting that shit for the last year, find a club in town where that hasn't been happening. But again, that's easy for me to say. All your friends train at that club. Man, that's really tough. So I'm cognizant that there's a very strong, bias towards the only option that people have, which is going back and training like normal, in a population that at best is going to be 25% fully vaccinated and probably half vaccine hesitant.
Yeah.
It seems like. So what do you say to those people?
I mean, I think that and I have the luxury of I mean, my outlet for training is in jiu-jitsu, and as well as other as FMA as well, which that can be done with masks, and actually, depending on the weapon you use, can be done at a better distance. So, for myself, I've been able to have an outlet through that. Now, for those who only have jiu-jitsu as their outlet and who only have the option that you're speaking of, which is, yeah, basically, I have to just go back to my school. My thought is again, if you've weighed the risks and benefits, and I actually, like, on Facebook, I'm part of physicians dad jiu-jitsu group. Those kind of things exist, and a bunch of them are training, a bunch of them are competing. So some of them have made that calculus, and to my knowledge, none of them have gotten sick. So I think that if the local incidence in your area is quite low, and not even that's not like, and as I mentioned, let's not just talk about case rate. Like, if your hospitals are actually pretty well managed right now, like they're not bursting at the seams, and this is what is going to like prevent you from punching a wall. It's probably safer than it used to be, but it again depends what state you're in. Like, Michigan right now is not doing so well. New York is still actually under. I don't think the gyms are open. In fact, I think a lot of the big names have gone to other places like Puerto Rico to train. But I know that there's schools in Philadelphia, for example, that are opened up. So people are doing it, and at this stage, we're 15 months or so. My personal calculus keeps me from going back, but I think that if people have made their personal calculus, I think it's probably a little bit safer than it used to be. And I also think, again, for your personal calculus, if nobody else is going to get vaccinated or nobody else cares about the precautions or whatnot, you yourself can make the decision. At least in the States, it's pretty easy to get tested. So you yourself can decide, all right, I am going to take this seriously. I want to get tested, and you can set a like an interval for yourself every 2 weeks or whatever it is.
I think from what you said, there's kind of two places that we need to go. One is discussing not death, but not mortality, but morbidity, the long-term effects, the whole COVID long hauler thing. And again, I'm biased here. I've had, at this point, I think 15 coworkers between ages 26 to 55 who've had COVID. And at least 3 of them, possibly 4, could qualify as long haulers. I mean, the 4th guy, super minor symptoms. I mean, his sense of smell and sense of taste isn't back yet, so we'll write him off. But 3 guys who are still, not all of them are back at work yet. The youngest guy's been off for 3 months, and I don't believe he's a malingerer. I don't believe he's working the system. I think he's an extremely bad long hauler. The other 2 guys, still not anywhere near 100%. One guy's hoping to come back soon. He went from being able to deadlift 400 pounds to barely being able to pick up his young child. So can we just talk about the long hauler context? And you, if I recall correctly, you're not a long hauler. You had COVID back in the spring of last year, and a couple months later, you were pretty much better.
Yes, as far as I know. I mean, for something so new, whether or not something happens to me decades later is unknown. But yes, as we still don't understand long haulers too well, but we are gathering more data as time goes on. And yeah, I don't have any of the typical described symptoms that a long hauler would have. I mean, Dr. Moriarty was mentioning his institution had a COVID long hauler clinic. We have one too. I would have to ask. I didn't get a chance to pick the brain of the doc there and see if they're noticing any patterns with lab work or whatnot. The best that I could read about, and there really isn't a lot, is that they suspect that people with long haulers have like this low level of persistent inflammation. Past that, I have not read anything that's even like physiologically sensible right now, and we just don't know.
I thought one other hypothesis was that there was still, like, your immune system may have knocked it down, but it's still got low levels of virus hanging out in your eyeballs or your testes or in your brain, kind of a reservoir. And it doesn't need to be one or the other. It could be both. It could be multiple explanations.
Right. I have not. I mean, I've not heard anything I've not heard any one particular thing that has been particularly convincing. You could be right. I mean, we may find that there may be some people are harboring small reservoirs somewhere. Again, though, this is not. This is a very still murky area that we don't really well understand. An interesting phenomenon, though, that again I have no great explanation for it, and has been circulating in the media, is that some people claim that when they get vaccinated, then their long hauler symptoms kind of subside. Again, if that's the case, great. I'm not sure how that will work. I guess maybe if what you're saying is your immune system didn't quite knock it out, and the vaccine kind of gives you that boost, maybe that's what knocks the rest of it out for some people. But I'm interested to see how that develops.
What are the numbers, just so people can put this into their risk calculus, of long haulers? Because I've seen numbers estimating about 10% of all COVID patients end up becoming long haulers. And then there was that recent paper, I'm trying to remember where it was published, saying something like 1/3 of people who've had COVID have ongoing neurological symptoms months and months later. And I don't know if that would make them a long hauler. So what's your best take on the percentage of people who have COVID who then become long haulers?
I mean, honestly, I would have to actually look through, various articles and whatnot. I've not been researching that particular question intently. I think anecdotally, a lot of the patients I work with they don't necessarily have long hauler symptoms. Then again, the particular population I work with is just chronically ill. So that's a toss-up. But in general, the typical symptoms described by long haulers, I'm not seeing a lot of my patients.
Well, based on your small data set and my tiny data set, maybe long hauler is something that happens more to younger people than older people.
Yeah, I guess it could be. And then again, I think the chronically ill who get hit pretty hard with COVID can end up with really bad things like, lung scarring and dialysis, kind of like kidney failure. So that actually comes out of long hauler, and that's just they just have a brand new problem now, which is awful.
How do we take the variants into account? And I bring this up because, again, where I live, variants, I think the UK version and especially the Brazilian version, the P1 version, they're at least half of the cases. And they're significantly worse. There's concern that they're going to evade the vaccines. There's concern that they're much worse for younger people. And then on the other hand, there was that data that I sent you prior to this suggesting that even though, if I interpret it correctly, that even though getting vaccinated may not give you as good protection against, say, the P1 variant, at the level of a society, if enough, like in Israel, if enough people are vaccinated, it still basically stops transmission.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things to keep in mind with the vaccines. People kind of look at the efficacy. I mean, because that's an easy thing to look at. It's the 90 something percent for Pfizer, Moderna, 60 something percent for Johnson & Johnson, and then 70% or so for AstraZeneca. And something to keep in mind is the transmission or the rate of people getting COVID was only one thing that we were aiming to do with the vaccine. Don't get me wrong, it's a very important part, but I think the most important thing is to try to reduce hospitalizations and ultimately death or severe COVID symptoms. All three, and actually all four. I mean, I honestly have read the least about AstraZeneca just because we're not using it a lot here, but at least Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson have shown to greatly reduce the chances of hospitalization due to COVID and death due to COVID. And that, to me, is the greatest argument for getting vaccinated. Now, with recent news, let's just we're going to take Johnson & Johnson kind of out of it. We can talk about that later if you like. But prior to the pause in Johnson & Johnson vaccinations, my recommendation was for anybody to get whichever one was available to them, because even if they got sick, because they would be a lot less likely to get seriously sick from it, which is all we care about, right? Common cold doesn't really kill us. That's why we haven't really found a vaccine for it. So ultimately, if COVID mutates into this thing more like the common cold, we'll be a lot less worried about it. But what we're worried about is it's killing people, lots of people. So the vaccines reduce the rate of those really serious consequences. Now, how do they do against the variants? So in general, if we take it variant by variant, the UK variant, even with that additional mutation in the spike protein, does seem to be neutralized by antibodies from people who have been vaccinated. You get to see some diminished neutralization activity with variants like South Africa and Brazil, but a decrease in neutralization doesn't mean that it goes down to zero. Dr. Moriarty was smart to point this out during his last talk with you. The flu shot, which a lot of people get annually, varies in its efficacy as well, and sometimes can be as bad as like 60 something, 70 something percent. So at this point we need to have people vaccinated, because even if there is a certain fold reduction in the neutralization of the virus in vaccinated people due to the variants, it can still be effective.
It still gives your body a head start when it then
Absolutely.
runs into the real virus. It's like, oh shit, I've seen this before. I've seen something like this before.
Yes.
And so, you said earlier that the enemy is the virus, and I would agree, but I don't think we're fighting one enemy. I think the other enemy we're fighting is disinformation and misinformation and the anti-vax movement, which just basically took COVID denial. Okay, here's a rant. If you're a jiu-jitsu school owner, I can understand how you would gravitate towards COVID denial. Oh, it's not so bad. Oh, I heard on Fox News that the survival rate is 99.998, which is 100% incorrect. That's basically coming from Fox News not being able to convert a decimal to a percentage. That's a long story. Email me if you want me to break that down for you. That's something I feel pretty comfortable in debunking. But I can understand why you would gravitate towards that if you love doing jiu-jitsu. I could see why you'd be training covertly. I don't think it's a responsible thing to do. I don't think it's a safe thing to do. I don't think it's good for the community. I don't think it's good for the jiu-jitsu community. But I understand. But now to immediately pivot from that to anti-vax, I think is insane. It's the one thing that is going to save us. And it's tribalism run completely amok. And the anti-vax people are going to create a reservoir of where this virus is going to have many, many, many more petri dishes to evolve in and come up with new variants. The more people have this thing, the more variants we're going to have, because it's the more experiments can be run. And so if you want to get back to training jiu-jitsu, for God's sake, get vaccinated. For God's sake, encourage people to get vaccinated. Otherwise, we're going to be dealing with the next variant. We're going to be dealing with the Chicago variant, or we're going to be dealing with we should care about the third world, or we're going to end up with a Senegalese variant. And that could shut everything down again, because it's going to be way worse than this one. So that's my rant. But I just don't understand the pivot. Like, the pivot from COVID denial to anti-vax seems insane to me. Like, one is understandable. The second is just cutting your own throat.
Yeah. I think you bring up a good point here, that we're this enemy that we're talking about in the beginning was this one thing with this virus. And yes, I agree with disinformation, with honestly fatigue. And I used to kind of simplify it, just talking about it with friends and whatnot, as being in the U.S. at least, as being a political thing. It's not. I mean, I have friends. I have friends. Friends. Everyone is just fatigued by this. So with that fatigue, and this is international. I bet this is international. With this fatigue, people are more likely to take risky behaviors because they just can't stand it anymore. Again, like you said, when we're talking about that fatigue, taking risky behavior, and then also like pairing that with a certain number of anti-vax sentiment, that really is, I agree that that's the vaccine wall or somewhat that people are starting to sort of talk about. So people are predicting in the U.S. that might happen soon, especially with Johnson & Johnson being on pause. Like any little thing that shows that the possibility of adverse events with the vaccine gives some kind of fuel to people who are anti-vaccine to even push that further.
I'm sorry, but the risk, like people are just so horrendously bad at estimating risk. I mean,
Agreed.
was your wife or your girlfriend ever on hormonal birth control? Oh yeah, because then her risk of having a blood clot is, I don't know, I don't have a pen and paper in front of me, but it was 10,000 times worse than with Johnson & Johnson, or at least 1,000 times worse. If you take a flight, I think it's like a 4-hour flight, it's like a 1 in 5,000 chance of having a blood clot. Now, it's a different kind of blood clot. I get that, but it's mostly treatable. Like people just, okay, I'm ranting. You're the guest. What do you think about the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson situation regarding clots?
Yeah,
and if I'm wrong, please tell me.
I do think, okay, so it's a developing investigation. Long story short, the type of clot is very serious. It's quite rare. It's cerebral venous sinus thrombosis. It's this big venous canal in your head. Developing a clot there is pretty bad. So, yes, at the same time, we've given in the U.S. close to 6 or 7 million doses of vaccine. X number of women in a certain age group have gotten this clot. From that, we are still going to have
to... Sorry, 6 or 7 million AstraZeneca.
No. Johnson & Johnson.
Okay.
And they both use adenovirus, and I'm gonna get into that next. So, I just read a paper in the New England Journal, Stephan. I can send it to you later. Because they did this on AstraZeneca. Well, the people who had the clots. What they're trying to look at right now is that the people presenting with these clots don't have the typical clots that, let's say, people who have a leg clot or a lung clot have. They have a clot that's more common with people who are on a certain kind of blood thinner called heparin or heparin-like products. The thing is, the disease that this clotting phenomena is mimicking is called heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. Before I get too far into that, basically what it is people who get a certain type of blood thinner create this protein complex that consumes all their platelets and creates a clotting problem. Basically, that's what they're seeing with Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca, except none of these people have received heparin, this blood thinning product. So where's it coming from? Well, one of the hypotheses that they're working with is the adenovirus delivery system itself, which has been shown to cause platelet activation. With platelet activation, you can then set off this cascade of events. You can create this scaffold, so to speak, and then they create this, basically this thing for clots. The adenovirus is one area that they're looking at. Another area they're looking at is the DNA within the adenovirus itself, and whether or not that can precipitate these chain of events. Again, this is still speculation. If it turns and the cases are still extremely low. So my current practice, well, it's not only my practice, but the U.S. has put a pause on Johnson & Johnson. Even if they didn't, I think it's prudent to tell people to hold off on Johnson & Johnson. I believe, have they started giving AstraZeneca again in Canada and in Europe?
In Canada, yes. But the guideline is not for people under age 55.
That's right.
Currently.
That's right. Yeah.
And I imagine that's going to change as more information becomes available, and maybe they'll get more targeted. Like I don't know, not for women who bruise easily and are on birth control, or whatever the set of criteria is going to be.
Yeah, I agree. I think so. There was a safety panel that met yesterday. I haven't heard anything about what they're deciding on that, but. Yes, if Johnson & Johnson does go back into circulation, then there may be some additional eligibility exclusions, such as if you're a woman between a certain age and a certain age, and or if you're on birth control, or if you've had clots before, that may make it That may put more restrictions on Johnson and Johnson. Fortunately, there's other vaccines out there, but unfortunately, Johnson & Johnson's advantage was that it was so easy to dispense. Refrigeration, one dose.
Single dose, wasn't
Yeah.
it? Yeah. So, I mean, but in terms of risk calculus, so we've got a fairly bad kind of clot happening. How many cases did you say out of 6 or 7 million? Something like 30?
The Johnson & Johnson, I think, is 6 so far. 6 out of, yeah.
All right, so 1 in a million so far.
Approximately, yeah.
Okay. And AstraZeneca was a little bit higher.
Assuming we haven't missed cases and assuming
Right.
that we don't find less severe clots that are also going
Sure.
to be due to this.
Okay. But the case fatality rate of COVID, even with all the new treatments, especially when you factor in the older population, is still 1%, or probably a little bit lower now that most of the older people have been taken care of.
Yeah.
And the long hauler complications are still 10%. So we're comparing something that's in the percentages, or at least to something that's 1 in a million or 1 in 100,000.
Yeah.
I wonder how many people are going to die because they're like, oh, this sounds scary. I'm not going to get anything. I'm going to wait. And like, probably that's going to end up killing, I don't know, 10,000 people.
Yeah, I think,
I'm so glad I'm not making this decision.
Yeah, I'm not either.
Governmental level.
I'm not either. What I've been finding in my practice, I haven't worked in the hospital since May of last year. So that's not my primary practice, but what I've been finding is, like, I've triaged people in my head. They're in the beginning of the vaccine effort. I'm getting bombarded by people who want the vaccine. So that's an easy choice. We just find them appointments and book them. Then come the next wave of people. Once you start running out of those people, I'm working on the people who are hesitant. Those who are saying, I think I should get vaccinated, but I'm worried about A, B, C. Mm-hmm. Those people, I think, as you mentioned, you're talking about good faith discussions. I usually, when you can speak to them and get a good number of them to become, more agreeable to the vaccine. I think that the relationship that somebody has with their personal physician is an important one. They can read. They can read whatever they want out there. Like they could read the primary literature. They could read, expert opinion and all that. But, when they come to see, their primary care physician, especially when the primary care physician has taken the vaccine or they've gotten sick or something like that, something like that is I don't think is quite measurable, but I think is on an observational level, I think is significant in kind of moving the hesitant group to getting vaccinated. And then finally you have the people who are just going to be stalwart, no, never, never have, never will. It's going to, time will tell what that true number is going to be, and time will tell to see what kind of damage that causes. But right now, the vaccine efforts worldwide are still, in my opinion, in its infancy. Yeah. And so, the big rush is, who can we vaccinate the easiest, the fastest, and while tracking, for, serious adverse events.
So what would you say are the top 2 or 3 concerns that your patients are coming to you with, and how do you address them?
Before Johnson & Johnson, the main concerns for my patients were things like, well, when I get the flu shot, I feel really bad. I don't want to feel really bad. And so I'm upfront with them. I'm like, look, this vaccine probably will make you feel bad, but then I share with them, I think it's helpful to share them my personal experience as a patient. Then I also share with them the experience that I had treating patients in the hospital. And I think we're all subject to bias. My bias here in New York and working in New York City is that I'm pretty confident, I'd be willing to put money on this. It's statistically impossible to find somebody who's not either been sick or has somebody close to them who has been sick or has died from COVID. So everybody understands, in New York City at least, the weight of COVID. So in my area in the Bronx, I've not come across too many stalwart anti-vaxxers. Some people are quite hesitant about it, but they're hesitant and not anti because they say, well, I've seen what this thing can do. So, that's kind of where that's kind of the population that I'm working with. That's kind of where the effort for my efforts are right now. I know it's different in different parts of the country. It's different in different parts of the world. So, another since Johnson & Johnson's pause came out, I've also dealt with the clotting question too, and I'm honest with that too. We just don't know yet. We don't know who we don't know if this is going to become more common, a more common thing. I come out and say that, look, you're going to give something to millions of people, potentially tens or hundreds or billions of people. Yeah, you're going to have some really bad things happen. Statistically, it's going to happen. But, I tell them, I say, you've seen what, COVID can do. There's a lot more people dying of COVID. There's untold amounts of people who have long hauler complications, and decades down the line, we don't know if this is going to be a risk factor for anything else. Cancer, heart failure, COPD, we don't know. And all we have the data that we've collected up to this point. And, 6 in a million or 1 in a million people, exclusively women for now, having this clotting disorder is, in my opinion, if it comes back into circulation, is a vaccine still worth giving, assuming that we've got enough data to say, okay, maybe these people shouldn't get it, or these are flukes or whatever it is.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, if you took 1 million people and you lined them up at a really, really big bar and gave every person in that lineup a shot of tequila, bad things would happen to some of those people.
Yeah.
I know you've been saying, we don't know, we're getting this data, and I know that's frustrating for some people. To me, it's deeply reassuring, because it means that, when an MMA coach says, when he does this will always work, that's a red flag to me, because it's not always going to work. You have the best counter in the world to something, and it's not always going to work. There's some people who can be impervious to it. There's sometimes the timing just isn't going to work, and so like somebody speaking from the mountain saying this is the way it is a huge red flag, and it's actually deeply reassuring to me to have somebody saying, this is the data we have right now. It could change. It also bespeaks a certain level of humility and undermines the narrative that you're being paid by the Lizard King or the Freemason.
Shh. We weren't going to talk about the Lizard King, remember? We talked about...
The first rule of being a lizard is not to talk about being a lizard.
Yeah. Stephan, I think that one of the things that I also try to kind of build a little bit of a timeline here. We've evolved our understanding of what's happening. Like, back when we were talking in September, if you asked me about the length of protection from natural infection or the significance of T cell function in COVID, I would have said, well, I speculate this, but we don't know. I mean, we've made progress in this. We now have good data. We've got good data that the antibodies are protective from natural infection and from the vaccine itself. We have growing data from showing that T cells are also going to be an important aspect of protecting someone against COVID. Really briefly, B cells are the things that create the antibodies. The antibodies neutralize the virus, prevent the virus from entering your cells. The T cells go around and find your infected cells and kill those cells. So they kind of operate. They somewhat operate on different operating mechanisms. So where the virus may skirt antibodies, your T cells can still have an effect on that. So again, I can't quantify this into, okay, well, now we should add this amount of percentage to your protection or whatnot. But what I can say is we've made some progress in this, and it's important to know that we've made progress in this, and that it's not just always, gray cloud, murky. Certain things are starting to clear up, but it's not going to be a sheet that's pulled, from over our heads. It's going to be a gradual picture that has to form.
So if you were in Israel right now, with its 60% of the population having received one dose and the numbers having just plummeted and transmission between people having plummeted, would you be training jiu-jitsu?
I might. I honestly might, because, I mean, Dr. Fauci has quoted something, 85 to 90% for herd immunity. So, I mean, even Israel, if they were at 60%, is not quite there. But still, their numbers are low. They've got wide adoption of the vaccine. And and I think some recent data just came out. I'd have to look at it closer, but they are, they're one of the biggest population pools for looking at how the Pfizer vaccine is doing, because they all got Pfizer. So it's showing to have decent protection against the variants. Ultimately, I think that Moderna is going to be pretty similar, but Pfizer has just been publishing a little bit earlier than Moderna. So, for now, a lot of the eyes are on Pfizer for that reason. But I do think that that Moderna will be similarly effective. Yeah, I might be a little more comfortable practicing or training in Israel.
Okay. So just to circle round, like, I'm wondering if we can come up with a more simple risk assessment heuristic for people who have been vaccinated and say they've received both doses of the vaccine and are trying to figure out what would make them go train. Can we just go over if we can't come up with a number, perhaps we can go over the factors that would make you more likely to train and the factors that would make you less likely to train.
Sure.
And then people have to come up with their own assessment between those two poles.
Sure. I mean, again, I'd start with how your hospital's doing. Case rates are one thing. Yeah, I mean, if your case rate's 50%, still, even if your case rate's 50% and your hospitals are still doing okay, I don't know if I'd go out. That's it. But yeah,
Case rate, you mean positivity rate?
Positivity rate, yeah.
Okay, so we got positivity rate and ICU percentage, basically.
Capacity, basically.
Okay, capacity.
Yeah, I mean, and the number as I look for in the ICU capacity specifically is something like 75 to 80%. How long has it been at that capacity? Okay. Again, the general public won't know this, but like when I see my hospital expanding the number of teams, I know that things aren't going well. But that's something the general public wouldn't generally have access to. I think another thing to consider is, what is your relationship with your local community? Like if you are, if you're in a community where, your group of friends has one type of feeling about COVID, the vaccines and everything, and they all want to get vaccinated. Your teacher's all on board with it. Sure, I mean I think that's an easier decision to make to go and try training. If that's not the case though, you may still consider to go training. Just you have to then factor in the other portions of the risk of you getting sick. Like that would be the other piece to consider. Like, who do I live with? Do I mind getting them sick? Let's just put it simple like that. Do I mind getting people I live with sick? So if you live alone, it's a simple answer. There's no one else to get sick. So yeah, let me go train. I don't care if my teacher is anti-vax or whatnot. That's about. For starters, I think that's about as simple as I can get with it right now.
So, positivity rate in your community. What percentage of people getting a COVID test or testing positive? The 6% in New York right now is better than the 15% in British Columbia. ICU or hospital capacity. The uptake of vaccination in your community, and whether or not you live with other people, and whether or not you're willing to take the risks of getting sick, probably not dying, but quite possibly having long hauler symptoms. So those are kind of the 5 things that we'd be weighing and trying to figure out.
Yeah, and honestly, so ICU capacity, positivity rate, and at least in the States, you can find a lot of counties doing this. You can even find out in general what percentage of the count of you could possibly find out the percentage of people vaccinated in your county. So that could be another like thing that could be reassuring to you if you know that if you live in an area where in the U.S. at least where you're like 40% of your county has at least gotten 1 dose of the vaccine. That's pretty good for the U.S. right now.
Okay. So we've talked about 5 factors. What about variants? Like if there's a variant explosion in your area, would you factor that in? If P1 is going through the roof, if the Brazilian variant is going through the roof, or are you not that?
No, I mean, I think you can look up which variants are blowing up in your area. That's usually, I mean, it's in the U.S. It's published through departments of health. Right now, as far as I can tell with the vaccines, there's pretty good coverage with it. Any kind of outbreak, though, no matter what the variant is, I'm less concerned about the variant, more concerned about if your area has an outbreak, like a surge, you should probably not train.
All right. So we have your 5 factors to consider, and I think we contextualize this pretty well by saying this is based on what we know right now.
Yeah.
And if I imagine that we'll be meeting up again in half a year or before then to discuss the situation. And I mean, I would love nothing more than to, declare victory over this goddamn thing. But
yeah, absolutely.
Do you think it's going to become endemic, that we'll just be dealing with this and you'll be getting your annual booster shot and it'll become less lethal as time goes on?
You know what? That is what I've read, and that's what some of the murmurings are. Because at the end of the day, this virus there's nothing personal about it, right? So if the virus can live without killing people and just spread and cause people to give people the sniffles, it's fine doing that. But yeah, in terms of whether this has become endemic, it's a possibility. If Pfizer's going to start trials, phase 3 trials on a booster shot. I've got relatives that are enrolled. So, this might become something where they do a joint flu COVID shot, and you get vaccinated once a year. So we'll if that happens, and then that'll probably become that'll probably be almost back to where we were being normal, because again, reminding people the flu does kill people.
Have you followed much of and now we're getting into kind of the realm of science fiction, but the speculations that with this mRNA vaccine technology that we'll be able to produce like personalized anti-cancer vaccines and so on?
I've not honestly read. I've not honestly read stuff other than like speculative pieces on that. Possibly. Could be
I mean, the number of people who've died from this thing is in the millions, but I mean, if that's the silver lining of this this dark cloud, that's a pretty significant silver lining.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we'll have to see. I honestly have not. I've not read that far into it to see how people are gonna take this and further innovate on it. But it's pretty impressive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when I think of the amount of science that's been done, I remember back in like February or March trying to console people. Like, if you throw 1 million scientists against a problem, you're probably going to find some results. And kind of this is a planet-wide Manhattan project. And it's, I'm beginning to feel hopeful now for the first time in a long time. So
I agree with you. I'm still very cautious, but I think I personally am in a better mental state about it than I was certainly a year ago, but even in September. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time, Nick. I know it's getting late over there, and good luck in your practice, and good luck in your medical practice, your Filipino martial art practice, and eventually in your jiu-jitsu practice too.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.